Acts chapter 22. It feels to me like a low energy morning. You feel like it's a low energy morning? No? Not some of you? Okay, good. Good to hear. For some of you, maybe. I was back there in the back this morning, and I just wanted to make sure you know that I am aware of the challenge of congregational singing for those of you that sit in the back couple of rows. And I just want you to know it's something I take seriously, and I want us to keep working on, and we are working on. Our challenge is trying to get voices back there. We can fill the room with tons of sound, which can be a little bit helpful, but what we really need to do to support congregational singing in the back rows is turn everybody around. The challenge, however, if we do that, is that we have new back rows. Then they're up here. But it is very hard to sing back there. Instruments are low, voices are low. It's just hard. So to those of you in the back rows, I'm just saying I'm aware of that challenge, and it's something we take seriously because supporting congregational singing is very important to us. So we will continue to work at that and do everything we can to try to help make it as easy as we can for you to sing to the Lord. By the way, Day by Day is a song that has new meaning to me. Because my Christian heritage is Swedish, actually. My father's family actually left Sweden due to religious persecution. And Day by Day is one of the hymns that is a reminder of the gospel going to Scandinavia. And Lina Sandalberg, who wrote that, wrote some 650 hymns. So that was not written in English, written in Swedish. And one of actually several hymns in our hymnody that are Scandinavian in their origins. And interesting, we had Day by Day and It Is Well in two out of the three songs there. Lina Berg lost her father in a small ship accident on a lake in Sweden. And that was the source of that text from her. So similar to Horatio Spafford's story with It Is Well. Anyway, I just love the reminder of God's people all over the planet singing his praises. So that was the mid-1800s that she wrote that text. You wouldn't think it reading those words, would you? Would you read that and think not written in English and written in the mid-1800s? Such a relevant text for us today. All right, how did I get off on all that? Oh, I listened to the singing from the back of the room. Okay. Here we go. By the way, you sing well, and I'm very, very grateful. I'm not chiding you for your singing. I'm chiding me for not helping support the people in the back in their singing. Okay, Acts 22. And once again, we are needing to cover a lengthy portion of Acts in order to follow the story here. So here in Acts 22, what I'd like to do, first of all, is just show us an overview of the four scenes that we have here in our text. And just a reminder that we're posting sermon preview videos each week and letting you know what the text is for the coming Sunday so that you can read in advance, since we're trying to cover a lot at once. So first of all, in Acts 22, verses 1 through 21, we have Paul's speech to the crowd. Remember that this was the crowd that was trying to kill him in Jerusalem. The soldiers were taking him into the fortress, literally carrying him so that the crowd wouldn't kill him. And as they take him up the stairs, he asked to be allowed to speak to the crowd. And so what he said is there in verses 1 through 21, and we studied that in Bible study this morning. Now, the crowd did not respond well at all. They just wanted to kill him even more. So in verses 22 through 29, the Roman tribune tried to examine Paul to figure out what was going on. And he had a plan. His plan was to beat Paul until he told him what was going on, which plan did not work out when Paul told him he was a Roman citizen. So then, in chapter 22, verse 30, through chapter 23, verse 10, the Roman tribune told the Jewish leadership, you guys get together and tell me what's going on. What is all this uproar about? And that didn't actually work either. So the story ends in verse 11 with Paul in the Roman barracks, probably alone at night when the Lord Jesus appeared to him. So that's our 4 scenes, and all 4 of those scenes have to do with hearings or trials or examinations, because even in that 4th scene when Jesus appears to Paul, what he tells him is that you're going to go to Rome and you're going to be on trial there. You're going to testify there. So the overall theme here is summed up in the with the word in Acts 22 verse 1, brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I now make to you. So this is all about Paul's defense. The word is apologia, from which we get the word apologetics. The word refers to why you believe what you believe and why you live as a follower of Jesus. So in this section of Acts, we can learn about defending why we believe what we live, why we live how we live. Now, we might ask, should we really defend ourselves like this? I mean, in one sense of the word, we tell you, don't be defensive, right? Don't be so defensive. And Christians are supposed to, accept suffering for Jesus' sake. So should we really be defensive? And that's where there's this passage in 1 Peter 3 that we were talking about in Bible study that is so helpful. Peter says we should always be prepared to make a defense, same word, to anyone who asks us for a reason for the hope that is in us. Being prepared to make a defense is something we should do. And you'll notice that Peter says we should be ready to make a defense to anyone who asks a reason for our hope. And if you look at Acts 23, verse 6, the end of the verse, Paul says, let me tell you why I'm on trial. It's because of the hope and the resurrection of the dead. So, yes, we should be ready to defend our hope. Both passages say it. But is being ready for that kind of defense kind of like how the airline stewardesses helpfully get you prepared for a water landing as you fly over the desert? I mean, what's the chance you're going to be on the fortress steps with Roman soldiers carrying you in a crowd ready to tear you apart for Jesus, and you're going to need to speak to them? Isn't this kind of remote? And, well, we could talk about where religious freedom is headed in America, and I don't really know where it's headed. But even if we set that aside, I think you have opportunities to make a defense of why you believe what you believe and why you live how you live a lot more than you realize. Maybe you have non-Christian family who can't make sense out of why you live as you do. Maybe they make comments, at the holidays or other times about why you're doing things differently. Maybe you have coworkers or students or teammates or classmates who realize there's something different about you and make some sort of comments about that. As I mentioned in the last hour, parents, don't your children put you on the spot sometimes about why you believe what you believe or why you do what you do? Maybe they do it in a challenging way, like, hey, I don't know why you do that. I don't know why we have that standard. Or maybe, smaller kids often are just curious. Why? And you answer then, and they say, why to your answer? That is actually a more precious opportunity than you might be realizing. What about when a Christian brother or sister's faith is really struggling and they are asking hard questions about God? And what about Satan's temptations in your own mind and heart? The ways he tries to get us to question why we believe what we believe and why we live as we live. Like Eve, he tries to get us to question whether this actually makes any sense. So I don't think that being prepared to make a defense for the hope that is in us is actually preparing for something unlikely. I think you're doing it all the time, even just in your own mind and heart. So starting in our Bible study this morning, we were looking at a little 5-point outline about defending our life and beliefs. And those 5 points are taken from 1 Peter 3, but they're all illustrated in Acts 22. So the first point was defense. I'm just going to review this briefly. The first point was defense. Paul made a defense in Acts 22, verses 1 through 21. He explained to the crowd his deep Jewish heritage, his zeal for God, his strict upbringing in the law. He explained that these changes that had happened in his life were for some really good reasons. There was a shocking divine revelation. The resurrected Jesus came to him. He gave various ways in which that story could be verified. He even explained that when Jesus sent him to go to the Gentiles, it sounds like he didn't really want to go. But ultimately, he had to decide how he was going to respond to all this. The revelation of Jesus Christ, the revelation of God's will, the command of Jesus to go. What was he supposed to do? And so he confessed his faith in Jesus and he went. So that was his defense. Number two, we talked about his tone, because Peter says, when you make your defense, do it with gentleness and respect. And you know that people in our culture today, especially as portrayed in movies and music, even some of the music that just won Grammys, is very in your face. This is who I am. You better accept it. You better deal with it. And so we're not talking about that kind of a tone. The Christian defends himself, but not with the world's tone. So we see in Acts 22 Paul's respect for the Jewish people, his commonality with them, and zeal for God and God's law. He was really building bridges and trying to help them understand that he understood them. I mean, they were trying to kill him, and he had once tried to do the exact same thing to other people. So Paul tried to show them his respect, yet he still told them what was true, even though it was offensive. Jesus was alive. Jesus had come to him. Jesus had commanded him to go to the Gentiles. And so, of course, they were not at all excited about those things. They didn't say, "Oh, you're such a nice guy, Paul. We just like you." So then, number two was Paul's tone. Number three was Paul's focus. He was defending himself, but it was about Jesus. He told them about his Jewish heritage so that he could tell them that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah. He told them about his conversion so that he could tell them about the resurrection. Peter said, "In your heart, honor Christ the Lord as holy." That means set him apart as in the one and only most important place in your heart. Defend what you believe, not for your sake, but because Jesus is so important to you. You believe in him. You live for him. Okay? So that was Bible study. Defense, tone, focus, and that's all from the first scene, chapter 22, verses 1 through 21. So let's now just read through the next three scenes and the next two scenes really, and make some comments as we go along. All right, so verse 22. So verse 21, he finished by saying that Jesus said to him, "Go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles." Verse 22, up to this word, they listened to him. Then they raised their voices, and they said, "Away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live." That's pretty blunt. The earth would be better off without you. And so they literally wanted to kill him. Verse 23, and as they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air. Now, probably what those things are those are expressions of their horror. Their horror that he said Jesus told him to go to the Gentiles. Verse 24, as they're doing all that stuff, can you imagine the mob all doing that at once? Verse 24, the tribune ordered him to be brought into the barracks, saying that he should be examined by flogging to find out why they were shouting against him like this. So note that up to this point, the tribune still cannot begin to figure out what's going on. So he has a very twisted idea of how to figure that out. He's going to flog Paul. Now, had Paul ever been beaten before? Several times with rods. Remember, we talked about the Roman leaders and their right-hand man that had his bundle of sticks that he would use to beat people. Paul had been beaten with those sticks many times, and he had been whipped several times, but none of that was this. This is the scourging with the whip made with the leather bands, with the sharp pieces of metal and stone in them. It was a kind of whipping that would permanently maim people and sometimes kill people. So who else experienced that in the New Testament? Jesus. That was what the tribune was going to do to get Paul to explain this, as if Paul could explain why the crowd was so mad at him when really there wasn't a reason. Verse 25, but when they had stretched him out for the whips, when they were tying him up to flog him, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, "Is it lawful for you to flog a man who's a Roman citizen and uncondemned?" So a Roman citizen could get flogged, but only if it was a penalty handed down by a judge after a legal trial, not as a means of interrogation. Verse 26, when the centurion heard this, he went to the tribune and said to him, "What are you about to do? This man is a Roman citizen." So the tribune came and said to him, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" And he said, "Yes." Now, we might pause right there. You might say, well, how would they know he wasn't lying? And the answer is simply that being a Roman citizen was so serious that if you lied about it, you were in huge trouble. So in general, they took somebody's word at it until they could prove otherwise. "Are you a Roman citizen?" He said, "Yes." The tribune answered, verse 28, "I bought this citizenship for a large sum." Now that's some startling words. He just said, "I bribed my way into what I have." Now why is he saying that? I bought the citizenship for a large sum. Here's what most of the scholars guess. They think that he means, you don't look like much. You don't look like a Roman citizen. I know what it costs me to become a Roman citizen. They must be selling it cheap these days. If you got it somehow. That's what they think he means. And Paul says, no, I'm a citizen by birth. Take that. We do not know how Paul's parents, Jewish parents, became Roman citizens. There were several ways in which people could become Roman citizens. One of the common guesses is that, Paul was from up in modern-day Turkey, and if his dad served as a soldier in Roman army or something like that, he could have gotten citizenship that way. We don't know. But somehow his parents had received Roman citizenship, and so he was born with it. So that has to have just been a beautiful moment. I'm not sure what at the point, I'm not sure it accomplished anything for the Lord, but it must have been fun for Paul to be able to say that. Verse 29, "So those who were about to examine him withdrew from him immediately, and the tribune also was afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had bound him." Verse 30, "But on the next day, desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews, he unbound him and commanded the chief priests and all the council to meet, and he brought Paul down and set him before them." So here we have a gathering of, maybe it's the Sanhedrin, or maybe it's just some of them, whatever. It's Jewish leadership, and they're meeting because the tribune ordered them to. He called them, "Come meet and tell me what's going on. Why is the whole city in uproar?" And we should, Homer Kent points out that this is at least the 5th time that the Jewish leadership has needed to meet to try to consider Christianity. And it's more than 5, because they also met to try to make up the plan about the resurrection, the story to explain that and things like that. They met to try Jesus. They met to try Peter and John in Acts 4. They met to try the 12 apostles in Acts 5. They met to try Stephen in Acts 6. This poor group of men and this is 25 years later, so I don't know how much turnover there had been, surely quite a bit. But the top level Jewish leadership can't get away from this thing. They cannot get away. And so here they are again at the order of the Roman tribune, having to explain their response to Jesus. And so Paul's not going to miss this opportunity. Verse 23, "And looking intently at the council, Paul said, 'Brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day.'" Is that going to help the tribune figure out what's going on? A Jew just said to a bunch of Jews, "I got a clear conscience." Well, then what's going on? Verse 2, "And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth." What just happened? And that's probably because they believed that no one who was welcoming Gentiles into the people of God and supposedly bringing Gentiles into the temple could possibly have a good conscience. So when he had a good conscience, they hit him. Then Paul said to him, Ananias the high priest, "God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall." Are you sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law you order me to be struck? Whoo! Okay, his primary point is hypocrisy, right? You're here telling me that I'm not following the Jewish law, and you just gave me a penalty with there's not even a charge, much less a conclusion from a fair trial, and you just hit me. You're not following the law. So his primary point is he's a whitewashed wall. There's an outward show of following the law, and in reality, that's not what's actually going on. Paul hadn't even been legally tried yet, much less convicted, and they were punishing him. So Paul's pointing out the hypocrisy, but there's more than that going on, because Paul says God is going to strike you. That's not a wish. That's not a hope. That's not even a curse, as most people think of it. That is a prophecy. Because this Ananias was a terrible high priest, and a few years after this, he was going to die a miserable death at the hands of his fellow Jews. Longenecker writes, his final days, despite all his scheming and bribes, were lived as a hunted animal and ended at the hands of his own people. God was going to strike him, for he was a godless man. So Paul was actually prophesying when he said, God is going to strike you. But watch what happens next. Verse 4, those who stood by said, would you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. Now, there is so much debate about this verse and so much written about what's going on there. Was Paul being sarcastic? Was he saying, I didn't know he was the high priest because he's sure not acting like one? Or was Paul saying, if this was not an official meeting of the Sanhedrin, then it may not have been clear who the high priest was, and Paul had not been in Jerusalem for a long time. So was Paul saying, I'm sorry, I didn't know that was the high priest? I have a hard time seeing it as sarcasm since Paul quotes Scripture in what he says next. He seems to be too serious in his answer. See the end of verse 5, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people, is a quote from Exodus. So I have a hard time seeing it as sarcasm, but there are many people who think that's what's going on. I think it's more likely Paul didn't know who was the high priest, that his prophecy was from God, but not because Paul really knew that high priest was going to die. But regardless, one of the things that's interesting here is that it seems likely that there is some genuine contrition from Paul in verse 5, like he lost his temper. And he shouldn't have lashed out like he did at God's high priest if he would have realized. So I don't know that for sure. It's not clear, but it's surely an interesting moment. Verse 6, now when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other were Pharisees, he cried out in the council, brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. And when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. Now again, there's a lot written about this verse because the Sadducees did believe that things like angels and spirits existed, at least in theory. But what Paul was saying here was not at all something they could believe. First of all, they would not believe in resurrection. And second of all, they would not believe in some angel or spirit or resurrected being appearing to somebody on a road and talking to them. That was all way beyond what the Sadducees would accept. Verse 9, then a great clamor arose, and some of the scribes of the Pharisees' party stood up and contended sharply, we find nothing wrong in this man. What if a spirit or an angel did speak to him? That is really remarkable. These are men who do not believe in Jesus, yet they're arrogant enough to want to side with Paul against the Sadducees, stand up for one of their own. And so they concede, they're not going to concede that Jesus rose and appeared to him, but they concede that some angel or spirit might have spoken to him. That is startling. Verse 10, and when the dissension became violent. They're fighting. The tribune, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them, they're not only fighting, they're apparently grabbing Paul in the fight. He's getting yanked two directions. So the tribune commanded the soldiers to go down and take him away from among them by force and bring him into the barracks. You realize what that means just happened. The tribune ordered the Jewish leadership to meet. They got in a big fight with each other, and the soldiers came in with their clubs and knocked everybody out of the way and got Paul out of there. It is a wild scene. Verse 11, the following night, the Lord stood by him and said, "Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome." All right, so let's add 2 points to our list now, okay? So we're starting with point 4 after that very long introduction. Point 4 is conscience. Conscience. And let me take one of 2 significant rabbit trails this morning. When Dr. Andy Naselli comes to speak at our community seminar March 23rd, he's also going to be here Sunday, March 24th and speak in both of our services. And he's going to be talking about the conscience because he's co-author of a book that's titled Conscience, What It Is, How to Train It, and how to love those who differ. So I think you'll find his teaching on that very helpful, especially when it comes to matters of Christian standards and how our conscience plays into those decisions. So that's not really the aspect of conscience we're talking about here in Acts 23, but I just wanted to remind you that was coming. Okay, so our point, though, is that if your defense is going to be credible, you need to maintain a clear conscience. So in Acts 23, verse 1, Paul said, "Brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day." And Peter wrote that when we're supposed to be always prepared to make a defense, we should be having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame, so that there's not any actual evil that they could point to. So if we're going to defend what we believe and how we live, our defense should be credible. You know, I mentioned parents earlier, and parents, really, there's nothing worse we can do than have our kids ask us why we live how we live, give them the reasons for it, and yet they see that we don't live that way. That's like the worst possible combination of things, because you're both claiming a particular belief and obviously demonstrating that you don't really believe that. You don't really live that way. So there needs to be a clear conscience if our defense is going to be credible. We see that in 2 ways in Paul's defense. First of all, his clear conscience as a Roman citizen. The Roman tribune kept trying to figure out what Paul did wrong, and he never did figure it out. And that is exactly the point. He tried to listen to the Jews, couldn't figure it out. He listened to Paul's speech, couldn't figure it out. He panicked because he knew that he had a completely uncondemned man he was about to flog. And so what you've got in the final 8 chapters of Acts is this theme over and over and over and over again. They can't figure out what Paul's done wrong. Now, does that sound similar to the trials of Jesus? Nobody can figure out what he's done wrong, and testimony after testimony keeps saying, this man's innocent. And the reason why they couldn't find anything Paul had done wrong was because Paul was not a criminal. He was not a threat to the Roman Empire. He was not a lawbreaker of Roman law. And that, again, is just a huge theme here in this last section of Acts. And it's a relevant theme because there are many people in countries today, living in countries today, where the government says that Christianity is a serious threat to the government and the stability of the country. And so Christianity is oppressed because of its threat to the country. Now, so this is a little bit tricky because the point in Acts is Christianity is not a threat to the government. But we could all say, well, there's a big exception to that. Christianity is a threat to tyrants. Christianity is a threat to evil governments. So that's true, okay? But the point in Acts is that the Christian movement was not an illegal cult that the Roman Empire needed to shut down. It was historic Judaism accepting the Jewish Messiah, and it was law-abiding. Paul is able to say, I'm a law-abiding Roman citizen. I have a good conscience. And that should be what Christians can say too. Christians who do right are a blessing for any nation. And we should be able to say, without shame, I'm a good citizen. You want me here in your country because I'm a blessing to this place and these people. So this is Paul's clear conscience as a Roman citizen. All right, one other little rabbit trail here, because I don't know how to fit this into the sermon, so I'm just gonna wedge it in. Here we go. Acts 22 and 23 also show us that it's okay for Christians to insist that they be treated lawfully. This is a very important point. It's okay for Christians to insist that they be treated lawfully. We're talking primarily today about defending our faith and standing up for what we believe and how we live, but it's also true in this text that Paul insisted on being treated lawfully. So it is true that as Christians, we are willing to suffer injustice for the sake of Christ. Yet, we can still insist on lawful treatment when possible. Governments are from God, and they're supposed to uphold what is good and oppose what is evil. So sometimes we accept mistreatment for the sake of Christ, but that doesn't mean that Christians have a responsibility to just accept all mistreatment. We stand up for justice, and sometimes that can mean standing up for justice for ourselves, as Paul did here. So to use probably what would be the most likely relevant example here in America, if I happened to be someday arrested for public things I said about homosexuality, number one, I can view that as suffering mistreatment for Christ and accept it. And number two, I can also get a lawyer to see if it's being handled legally and they're really allowed to arrest me or imprison me, and I can contact politicians and see if the law really should be what it says, right? It's not unchristian to insist on lawful treatment, or even as a citizen with rights to vote and elect, to fight for religious freedom and things like that, while at the same time we recognize that ultimately we may just need to suffer injustice for the sake of Christ. The law may be what it is, the government may do what it does, I may not be able to do anything against it. So this is an important passage in preventing us from a hyper-pacifism, I think, is a good way to say it. Okay, that was a rabbit trail again. So we were saying Paul had a clear conscience as a Roman citizen, and that's a key theme in the last 8 chapters of Acts. Christianity was not an illegal, dangerous cult that was a threat to the Roman Empire. But in addition to his conscience as a Roman citizen, we also see Paul's clear conscience as a Jew. Again in verse 1, I have lived my life before God. See, before God. So now he's speaking as a Jew to Jews. Before God, I have a clear conscience. Now, was Paul saying that he had not sinned? I mean, this is the man who called himself the chief of sinners, right? So he's definitely not claiming some sort of perfection. What he's saying to the Jews is that he had never abandoned the Jewish faith. He had always sought to live for and please the God of the Jews. Well, how could that be? How can you care about the God of the Jews and believe in Jesus? Because he believed that Jesus was sent by the God of the Jews as the Savior for the Jews, as the hope of the Jews, the fulfillment of the promises for the Jews. Though it made them very angry, Paul insisted, I'm a Jew with a clear conscience. I'm not an apostate from the faith. I'm a Jew who believes in the Jewish Messiah. Remember how this whole scene started. How did he get in so much trouble? What was he doing that got himself in so much trouble? He was in the Jew as a Jew with Jews participating in Jewish worship. And some liars showed up and said he brought a Gentile into the temple with him, which wasn't true. So our general point is conscience. Maintain a clear conscience before God and the government. That doesn't mean perfection, but sincerely seeking to honor God and obey the governing authorities so that if someone makes up lies about you or puts you on the defensive, your defense will be credible. All right, and then finally we arrive at the climactic point, number 5, hope. The most remarkable parallel between 1 Peter 3 and Acts 23 is that in both places it talks about a defense of your hope. You see it in 1 Peter 3, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. And it's in Acts 23, verse 6, We mentioned it earlier. It is the end of the verse. It is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. And the grammar people tell me that the hope and the resurrection is a hendiades, which I didn't know what that was, so I looked it up. And it means that one word describes the other, and it's the resurrection hope. The resurrection hope, or the hope that is resurrection, the hope of the resurrection. There had been this is great, there had been no formal charges against Paul, so he got to define them. Why am I here? Well, since neither the tribune nor the Jewish leaders could explain why he was there, he said, I'll explain why I'm here. I am here because of the resurrection hope. It wasn't really about Gentiles coming into the temple. It wasn't really about Paul telling people not to follow the law. It was really about the resurrection hope, which Paul insisted was Israel's hope. Daniel 12, the Jewish prophet Daniel said, many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting contempt. But it wasn't just specific references to resurrection that were the heart of the Jewish hope. It was like that passage we read today in Haggai chapter 2. That passage, those promises, they require something more than just this broken life. They're pointing to some kind of life that doesn't end, some kind of better world, some kind of eternal life. All the promises to Israel demand something more than this broken life. And so the hope of Israel was the hope of resurrection and eternal life and an eternal kingdom. Longenecker writes, Christianity is rooted in the Jewish doctrine of the resurrection of the dead. The Sadducees didn't believe that, but the Pharisees did. And so Paul appealed to his fellow Pharisees who believed in the hope of the resurrection. We learned earlier in Acts, we learned that in the Gospel of Luke, the Pharisees are surprisingly friendly with Jesus, frequently inviting him into their home. And then we see in Acts that there are Pharisees who are getting saved, and they're still Pharisees. They're Christian Pharisees. It really wasn't possible to be a Christian Sadducee because they rejected so many things that were tenets of the Christian faith, but it was quite possible at this stage in history to be a Christian Pharisee. And so Paul appeals to the Pharisees and says, this Jesus is the fulfillment of your hope, your resurrection hope. And so it's true that Paul was being shrewd when he did that. It's true that Paul sparked a debate between the Pharisees and Sadducees. But that wasn't ultimately what he was doing. Ultimately, what Paul was doing was challenging the Pharisees to consider one more time the possibility that Jesus was the fulfillment of their resurrection hope. The real issue is whether or not Jesus is the fulfillment of the resurrection hope. And I know that I've already preached on the theme of the resurrection in Acts, but I just want to show us again that in this last 8 chapters of Acts, Paul just keeps emphasizing it. So will you follow me to a couple places ahead in Acts? Acts 24. Acts 24. So now Paul's before the governor Felix, and he says, Acts 24, verse 14, but this I confess to you. Okay, so this context is so interesting. Back in verse 10, verse 11, he says, you can verify that it's not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem, and they did not find me disputing with anyone or stirring up a crowd. Verse 13, neither can they prove to you what they now bring up against me. So he's saying the same thing as happened in 23. There's no real charge here. So I'm going to tell you what the real charge is. Verse 14, but this I confess to you, here is my wrong, Roman governor, that according to the way which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers. I worship the God of the Jews, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men themselves accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. That is so good. He says, okay, I confess. I'm guilty of believing the same thing these men believe in, and that is the hope of the resurrection. promised by the God of the Jews. That's what I'm guilty of. Chapter 25, verse 19. So now Paul's before another governor, Agrippa. Acts 25, verse 19. And so this is Agrippa talking to Festus about trying to figure out what Paul did wrong. And he says in verse 19, verse 18, when the accusers stood up, they brought no charge in this case of such evils as I supposed. You see how this theme won't end? You can never figure out what Paul did wrong. Verse 19, rather, they had certain points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. So this is exactly what Paul would have wanted. The Roman rulers were finally figuring out that this was about resurrection. Chapter 26, verse 8. Paul says before Agrippa, why is it thought incredible by any of you that God raises the dead? And look down at verse 22. To this day I have had the help that comes from God, and so I stand here testifying both to small and great, saying nothing but what the prophets and Moses said would come to pass, that the Christ must suffer, and that, by being the first to rise from the dead, he would proclaim light both to our people and to the Gentiles. Christ is the resurrection hope for all people. And note what he says, by being the first to rise from the dead. As Paul would teach elsewhere, Jesus is the first fruits of the resurrection. It's the first fruit on the citrus tree each winter that assures us that the rest of the crop is good. Jesus is the first to rise from the dead, assuring us that all those in Christ will rise to eternal life also. So, the Pharisees believed in resurrection, but Paul was challenging them to consider how it was going to happen. How would resurrection be possible? And that is very relevant today because we still live in a Western culture in which most people have some belief in heaven, which means they have some belief in resurrection in some way. Some sense of it, they believe that people keep living or live again. Many people have a resurrection hope or at least a resurrection wish because God has set eternity in their heart. But how? Ask them how. How? I mean, there has to be a how, right? How do people who die keep on living? And if they happen to be in some place that you would like to think of as heaven, where all your family has died is there, as most people would think of, where did that place come from? What is that place? How do people get there? How? And for most people, there is no how. It is pure wish. And so this story is so relevant because just like he says to the Pharisees, Jesus is the fulfillment of your resurrection hope. It is also true that for our people today and all of their heaven wishfulness, Jesus is the fulfillment of that. He is the how of resurrection. He is the how of heaven. And so Paul calls it the hope. This is the hope. Death is the enemy of humanity. Christians, we cannot be afraid to be the people who are always reminding people about death. I don't literally mean always. I don't mean like every conversation you have, you should be talking about death. But I mean, we cannot be ashamed to be the people who do bring up the reality that we are all dying. And that all the science and all the technology and all the medicine in the world has not yet prevented any human being from dying. Death is the enemy of humanity, and thus resurrection is the hope. And so when you defend what you believe about Jesus, the bottom line is about death and life. It is about the hope of the resurrection. So we have talked about defense and tone, focus, conscience, and hope. We should defend why we believe what we believe and why we live how we live. We should have a tone of gentleness and respect that honors the Lord. Our focus should be on the Lord. It's ultimately a defense of Jesus. Our conscience should be clear, and the real bottom line is the hope of the resurrection from the dead. Now, how do you respond to this sermon? It's in some ways a hard type of sermon to respond to. So let me make 3 suggestions. Maybe someone here, or 4 suggestions. Maybe someone needed to be reminded that it's about Jesus, not you. Maybe you got caught up in a wrong motive, like we mentioned in Bible study this morning. You can get so excited about apologetics that you actually, it's not you're excited about the defense of Jesus anymore. You're excited about being right and about showing other people that you're right and they're wrong. Now, it's great to show other people that Jesus is true, but it's very different to show other people that you're smarter than them and righter than them. And so maybe this morning you needed reminded, oh yeah, it's about Jesus. It's not about me being right. It's not about me protecting my own ego. So there's that possibility. And then a second thing I would guess is that for many of you, what you need to do this morning is go away just with a heightened awareness of how many opportunities you have to explain why you believe what you believe and why you live how you live. And so that you might be more intentional about them. You might see them as small and insignificant, and I would like you this morning to start to see them as really significant because they're about Jesus. You might see them as small moments, or it might just be the smallness of the person that is making you see it as a small moment. Don't. Small persons can honor Jesus too. And when small persons ask big questions about Jesus, those are so important. So whether your moments are small or big, I hope you might get excited about every chance you get to talk about why you believe what you believe and why you live how you live. So that's a second line of thinking. And then a third line of application here is there could be somebody here today who is really under fire for your faith. There may not be soldiers carrying you to keep you away from the crowds who want to rip you apart, but it feels kind of close to that. You do feel like you got some people who wouldn't mind ripping you apart because you're a Christian. And so I hope that this morning's an encouragement to you. And we really haven't talked about chapter 23, verse 11 yet, and I want us to finish there. That it might be an encouragement to you if you really are under fire from your family or your friends or your coworkers or your teammates or whomever it might be because you're a Christian. Back to chapter 23, verse 11. The following night, the Lord stood by him and said, "Take courage. For as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome." I mean, I imagine there were guards around, but I think in general we could say Paul was alone. He was at least alone in the sense of not having friends and things there with him in the Roman barracks. And we can be quite certain that he was discouraged because Jesus says to him, "Take courage." Wait a second. Jesus appeared to him on the night when he told the crowds in Jerusalem who wanted to kill him that Jesus had appeared to him. And they tried to kill him for that. That night, Jesus appeared to him again. Isn't that itself cool? And then Jesus says, "Take courage. Be encouraged, because thousands of people in Jerusalem are going to get saved because of your testimony today." Well, we don't know if anybody got saved because of his testimony that day. So what did Jesus say? Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome. What's the encouragement there? I think it's simple. This was God's will, and you were faithful to it. And you're going to get to do it again. Oh, great. I'm going to get to have people who want to kill me again? Well done, good and faithful servant. And you're going to go testify in Rome also. Paul may have been discouraged because he saw how violently they reacted, and he was so heartbroken that nobody believed. And Jesus basically said, "It's okay. You just be faithful to me. Do what I called you to do." And notice that little phrase, finally, the Lord. What did Jesus do? stood by him. I don't know what that means. I don't know if this is another physical appearance of Jesus to him, or if this is in a dream or a vision. But somehow Paul's experience was that the Lord stood by him when it seemed like nobody else was there. Jesus was with him. And this is what Jesus had promised. He had said, I will be with you all the way to the end of the age. And there he came and stood by him. If you are fighting hard to stand up for your faith, and if you are weary and discouraged, I pray that Jesus would draw near to you and remind you that he stands by you. Even if it seems like your testimony is in vain and everybody just gets more upset at you the more you try, I think Jesus would say, be encouraged. Your faithfulness is not in vain. Jesus stands by you.